I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. War is a matter of strategy. The burden of affirmative is just to prove that the most strategic way right now is just based on 2 fronts. Number 1, it's about having more emphasis on the efficiency of your resources within war, and secondarily on your international standing and how is it that other countries are going to view Ukraine because of this expansion of military operations. It's about having to prove why, because of these things, we're able to place Ukraine in a better position in the war to reach the path of victory, of reaching a more probability of a ceasefire and peace negotiations with Russia. Therefore, the burden on side negative is having to justify why is it that you continuously need to take resources away from the front lines of Ukraine just to continue the expansion towards Sudan and Syria. But first, on the context of the Ukraine-Russia war. Number 1, there is a stalemate within Ukraine borders with a war with Russia. This means that number 2, Ukraine is on a constant back foot, constantly are on the defensive side. Note that the primary goal of this entire war for Ukraine is to always push back against Russia. This is important because the intention within this war is to always regain the borders that is lost from Russia. And this is important because of 2 things. Number 1, because of the principle of how they owe an obligation to their own citizens, how so many of their citizens died from this particular war. This means that it is important for them now to regain these kinds of borders so that they can have more footing for a ceasefire and peace negotiation against Russia. Note that this means that their goal was never about territorial expansion. They never had an incentive to be the aggressor to begin with. Therefore then, for peace negotiations to actually start effectively, the reason why this is important to now push back Russia is because if you were to do it now, you lose a large chunk of your borders because a lot of Russian troops are still within Ukraine itself. Therefore then, right now, it's still not the best way to do so, insofar as expansion of military operations hampers your chance to achieve a more effective point of peace negotiations. Secondarily, what do these special forces units look like? They are extremely effective special forces that receive high-class training from the Navy SEAL. They look like specifically specialized in exclusive and special operation. This was like assassinating local leaders, executing these kinds of specific generals with these kinds of highly skilled and high technology kind of weapons as well. Thirdly, it's also important to note that resources in war is something that's important. As long as resources are something that is finite and the allocation of resources is something that is zero-sum, the shifting resources in war is something that is feasibility is going to be something that's hard. Because number 1, Sudan and Syria are extremely far from Ukraine. You need to cross multiple borders in order to reach Sudan and Syria. This means, based on geographical factors, these special forces units are placed in an isolated area. This means that when they are hurt, when they are harmed, and injuries are especially arbitrary and especially easy in times of war, this means that it is very hard for you to gain aid and support from the local headquarters of Ukraine because it's hard for you to transport all the resources. Even if you want to do those things, this just means that you have to justify allocating and shifting more resources into these kinds of military operations. This also means that number 2, you're trading off fighting in the front lines as well. This means that onto the discussion of what is the best pathway to victory for Ukraine. The comparative here in the debate is easy. Number 1, is it better to win by crippling Russian resources via the military expansion, or is it number 2, to change and to place those strongest forces, these special forces, into the front lines of Ukraine? Let's question the extent of the crippling of Russian resources when it comes to the military expansion. No, the reason why Ukraine is doing now is because they believe that this is a good way to cripple Russian resources because Sudan and Syria have a relationship with Russia. This looks like Russia investing and giving them loans in return of like investing within their military. This looks like oil and resources are things in Sudan and Syria that contribute to Russia's economy. But also, it is also important to note that this means that Ukraine is the aggressor when it comes to expanding their military forces in Sudan and Syria. What does this Russian military and mercenary forces in Sudan and Syria actually look like? It's important to note that they are not Russian citizens. They are paramilitary groups that are hired by Russia. They are your local citizens of your Sudan and Syria. They are your remnants of the conflict that happened in Sudan and Syria before. This means that Russia has always the visibility and capacity to hire more paramilitary groups within Sudan and Syria. This means that because they are always a remnant of your local militants, Russia always have the leverage to always pay them lower wages. Therefore, therefore it is cheaper for Russia to actually just hire more military groups within Sudan and Syria. What does this mean? This means you may be able to hamper Russia's military expenses, but this is mitigatory at best. Why is this so? Because your special forces in Sudan and Syria are not specifically targeting the administration and the state of Sudan and Syria. As long as Sudan and Syria are still fundamentally pro-Russia, they will still continue to send humanitarian aid to Russia directly, which then directly impacts the livelihoods of your citizens, livelihoods of your other kinds of troops in Ukraine in itself. Therefore, this means the impact of this is number one, it is largely inefficient to do so, but also note that number two, when Ukraine is the aggressor in this situation, you now eliminate all of your chances to have a good relationship with Sudan and Syria. This is important because Sudan and Syria are countries with relationships with other countries who are also pro-Ukraine, countries like Turkey. This means you ultimately force countries like Turkey who take a stance, to force them to take a stance when in status quo, they are already pro-Ukraine to begin with. This means you legitimately put yourself in a situation to live up to the arbitrary circumstances for other countries to go against you. What is the counterfactual? The counterfactual is shifting special resources, the special forces back in Ukraine. What does this look like? When you put the special forces back in the front lines of Ukraine, you effectively change the asymmetry of power within the front lines of Ukraine. Why? Because these special forces, you can effectively put them in the Donetsk region. This is where the main conflict is. This is where the main conflict started as well. This is where majority of the Russian forces are going to be. This was like sending them to also assassinate to the Russian generals because they already have these kinds of specialized skills to assassinate generals to begin with. This also like specifically identifying the Russian generals and target them for assassination. But even so, even if you want to shift these special forces somewhere and not in the front lines, even if you want to do so, to maximize efficiency, send them to Belarus. This is where a country where it's legitimately a Russian puppet. This is where you can effectively then take down the international optics of Russia. This is where you can effectively take away Russia's resources compared to just sending them to a territory where it is just Russia's paramilitary groups. Lastly, on the argument of international optics, we see that in status quo, there's already a huge rise of international support for Ukraine. This looks like this is important because Ukraine ultimately needs these kinds of support and aid to continue to survive within this war. But the problem is, there's already criticisms towards Ukraine because of their actions of wanting to expand military in Sudan and Syria. This is ultimately because of two reasons. Number one, international countries recognize that this is an unstrategic and inefficient move, but also number two, majority of the countries support Ukraine because they subscribe to a non-interventionist principle. This was like Romania, even though they are pro-Ukraine, not sending troops to Ukraine because they subscribe to this particular principle. They understand that the main way to solve conflict is to use it in a humanitarian way and to not be the aggressor in this kind of conflict. Note that this also means you directly go against the American interest because America has an interest within Syria as well. The instability within Syria is important because America is part of NATO who gives large chunk of funding towards Ukraine's troops. This means ultimately you lose out on your international optics. You lose out on a lot of your resources for a strategic war side with Affirmative.
4 things in this speech. Firstly, why Russia is single-handedly the worst actor on planet Earth, and so the metric by which you must judge this debate is by the person who curtails them the most. Secondly, some characterization on what these wars actually look like. Thirdly, how we, in the short term, curtail Russia. Fourthly, how we build long-term momentum against the Russian regime. Firstly, then, on why Russia is single-handedly the worst actor. A couple reasons here. Firstly, among superpowers, they are the only one with a one-man dictatorship and virtually no checks and balances, right? Like the US has Congress, even other authoritarian superpowers like China have the whole body of the Chinese Communist Party. Russia doesn't have that. It just has Putin. It just has one man who has shown himself to be a particularly nasty, narcissistic person. Secondly, because Russia forms, staying in that point, it's been proven then that Putin will do whatever he can to get whatever he wants, regardless of whether it is the rational thing to do or not. For example, the First and Second Chechen Wars, the Georgian War, the Ukrainian war that is currently ongoing, that he has put troops in Belarus, that he has troops in Moldova, on all of these things that have just absolutely show that Putin wants to be able to have this kind of foothold on the world. Secondly, that Russia forms alliances, therefore, with the worst countries on planet Earth, right? Like their allies is the Assad regime in Syria, it is North Korea, it is mercenary groups in Sudan, the types of people who inflict massive amounts of pain on their countries and communities. Thirdly, that for a variety of factors, that now means that this is entrenched within Russia. Because it has happened for a very long amount of time, there is a large amount of built-up intense nationalism within Russia, that there is an intense amount of racial superiority over the types of people that they are subjugating to their regime, that thirdly there is a grievance and a vengeance towards the territory that they have lost in the USSR and afterwards, which is why we are seeing that increase into Ukraine. Why is that important? Russia wants to act terribly and therefore has the power to do so. What do I mean by that? Firstly, Russia has a giant stockpile of weaponry that is left over from the Cold War. Massive amounts of nukes, massive amounts of missiles. They also have lots of alliances that have also been built up from particularly pervasive and bad people. This gives them influence, this gives them a great amount of power over Africa, over the Middle East, which is particularly bad, because if they start to influence far more of the world, we start to see far more of these proxy wars show up. Why is this relevant? We have shown you that Russia is a particularly evil and powerful presence that is a threat to the world, and they are particularly unpredictable. So countries like the US, like the EU, doesn't want to invade them because they know that they might do something irrational and blow them the fuck up. Therefore, Ukraine is the only country that can curtail this, because what's Russia going to do? Invade them again? No, right? They've already done it. So because of that, we think it's like we're the only person who can stand up to this. At the end of this debate, you should judge this, at the end of this point, you should judge the debate on who best is able to curtail Russia the most. The things that they wanted to bring you is why we helped them win the Ukrainian war. We can also do that, but like this isn't an active debate on Ukraine, right? This is who is able to stop Russia the best. We think that we're able to do that. Secondly, some characterization on what these wars look like. Because contrary to like the kind of characterization we heard at first half, these aren't like wars that have tens or hundreds of thousands of like boots on the ground troops. These are special forces wars where there are hundreds or maybe thousands of people in these countries that set up in camps and guerrilla type warfare. Why do we think that's the case? Firstly, because both countries have a revealed preference to be able to fight in the major war that is happening, which is Russia versus Ukraine. And because Ukraine doesn't want to cease to exist as a country, and Russia doesn't want to lose that war, clearly they're going to put most of their troops there. But secondly, because like these wars look like that because Russia needs the resources, they want to be able to hold these African countries to ransom. For the longest time, they've not needed tens of thousands of troops in this area. They've only needed 100 because nobody is screwing with them. Secondly then, on how in the short term we curtail Russian expansion. Firstly, in Sudan and Syria, Russia is currently propping up massive amounts of warlords and rogue leaders in these countries. And that's important because they're not actors that people even in their own country agree with. Because of that, we don't think they get a massive amount of support. But importantly, they inflict a massive amount of pain on their populations. Ukraine stops them from doing that. Here's how. Oh yes, here's how. Firstly, they kill Russians, right? Like the Russians send paramilitary organizations, or maybe it is true that they hire people in those countries, but those are people who do their bidding anyway, and Ukraine finds them and they blow them up, or they go in and they kill them. Importantly, it's not important that like if maybe they get it wrong the first or the second time, but so long as you blow them up in the end, it doesn't actually matter. Secondly, that there's a massive calculus in the way in which Russia operates in these wars, because on the counterfactual, they're just able to go in and be able to assert their power on these countries no matter which way they want to, so they're not particularly like strategic about it. Now they know that an actual legitimate army is there to fight them, and because of that, that they have to start being more strategic about the things they do. They have to start hiding more information from them. That's when the comms start to break down and things in wars start to get a little bit messy. What that means is that there's a massive drain on resources, because now you need far more resources in order to upkeep it, but also you just do less bad things because now there is someone actively fighting against you on those bad things. The direct outcome here is that Russia chooses not to interfere more in the war because it's a massive drain on their resources, and as we said, they actually want to be fighting that major war. That direct impact is really good. Secondly then, before Russia was involved, these were particularly close wars, but now Russia tips it over an edge. On that side. This is particularly important because these wars happen either way. The mercenaries exist in Sudan either way. The Assad regime exists, or fighting in Syria rather exists either way. Russia just makes sure that the worst people are the people leading that. Ukraine going in stops Russia having a total victory in that war because they were particularly close before they came in. That is good because if Russia have victory, then they're able to go back to Ukraine, or they're able to go to different African nations of which they're able to extract the resources of those countries. Russia is able to do all of the terrible things that they were doing before that they want to do. Importantly, Russia is in here because they are a bad, malicious actor, but also because there's massive amounts of resources for them in these countries, massive amounts of uranium, massive amounts of oil, and because of that, they're able to extract those resources. We stop them from doing that in lots of different countries because currently they're fighting in 2 or 3 countries. Why do we stop them building long-term momentum as well? We do that by building up alliances within Ukraine and within the West. Ukraine is the country in the West that has staked their name on ensuring that Russia doesn't get total domination. What I think that means is that the EU secretly helps them out. When the EU and the US secretly help them out, you start to get those smaller African nations too. You start to build that resistance. Nobody wants to cooperate with Russia anymore because someone is finally standing up to them. Cheers.
Judges, I just want to clarify that this is not an actor debate, it is a value judgment debate. This means we're not debating on the best interests of Ukraine, insofar as we prove to you why we're able to strategically dismantle the war better on our side. We're going to take this debate. As to the point of all of which NC's arguments stand, I'm just going to weigh this debate out on 4 things. Firstly, on the cost of the military operations. Secondly, on the perceptions of Ukraine attacks actually manifesting in the first place. Thirdly, on how we have the better strategy to edge over the war. But fourthly, then, the impact of this military expansion. But before all of that, just one response towards side negative 10 and how I'm just immediately going to dismantle their win con and why they don't stand in this debate. Right? Firstly, then, he spent a huge significant portion of this case debating as to why Russia is bad. I think we agree to this. This shouldn't be granted within this debate because it's an unnecessary thing, right? But I think that we call for this debate then becomes 2 things. Firstly, who is better to tip the asymmetry of power in terms of strategically ending the war? But secondly, then, who better than mitigates the harms of a Russian attack? I think this claim of Russia just being bad should be taken for granted within this debate. I think that's a given. So secondly, then, are they able to prove their win condition within their speech? Note, Judge, that firstly, they run a negative case as to why you shouldn't send this military operation. I think all of those claims that will be later weighed out. But secondly, then, their counter model of how they want to push Ukraine armies into Sudan to save citizens. Judge, is a ludicrous claim to make 3 reasons. Firstly, that's likely not going to happen because Eunsi's argument how you don't have enough funding in the first place in order to send these military troops or in order to send your special forces are already one that is insignificant. Note, Judge, that she clearly tells you how you're extremely reliant on aid from other countries. This means it's extremely unlikely for you to send a bigger, vast amount of troops into your Sudan region in the first place. But secondly, everything Eunsi talks to you about on cost, on the optics towards your attacks, on the perception of Ukraine's attacks becomes all the furthermore exacerbated at the point of which you want to do this. That means Ukraine will be villainized as an actor at the point of which you want to send more people infringing the sovereignty of another nation in terms of then saving their citizens. Thirdly, then, the likelihood of you achieving this. Note, Judge, that these resource camps or these resource pools are likely going to be regions that are huge, regions that are populated with huge amounts of citizens. The likelihood of success of you rescuing every single Sudan citizen is one that is unlikely. I think you just further villainize your war. But fourthly, taking away the soldiers from your front lines in terms of sending them and redeploying them. Eunsi already tells you why this battle is extremely tangent or extremely proximate towards the front lines of Ukraine, and the point of which you move these troops away and deploy it into another region, that's when you open Ukraine to points of attack. That's extremely vulnerable, Judge, because at the point of which you don't have your soldiers on the front line, Ukraine falls immediately towards Russian troops that are already pushing towards the front line and are able to have that avenue to continue pushing forward. All of those reasons then, Judge, we clearly break their win con. We don't have anything to substantiate their case. Why does Eunsi then clearly win from first within this debate? Weighing then first thing on the cost of military operations, why is this extremely expensive? Judge, she tells you how to cross the extremely many borders, therefore the sum to move your troops is one that's already expensive. Note that this becomes way worse on their side because you multiply this to however many Ukraine troops that you're sending, right? We tell you also that this is not the most effective way of funding because in terms of your weapon allocation, in terms of bringing back troops from Sudan and Syria towards Ukraine, in terms of moving people around and deployments of troops within those areas, in terms of managing and mitigating your comms and comms interception, all of this require costs. At the point of which we tell you there's a much more better allocation of funding, this is when we win this clash entirely. 2 ways how we get funding better. Firstly, the funneling of this funding towards people on the ground who actually require it. This means aid and foreign aid towards individuals who get hurt, foreign aid towards individuals who actually need it. Secondly, your mobilization of your citizens towards regions that likely use it as well. You're finding shelters from Russian troops and Russian attacks that likely happen within your Ukrainian region. This also means that you're likely able to signal help from other nations to ask for troops, your US and NATO regions, as to how you're able to get help in order to train troops, how you're able to signal for help in order to get money. All of this better funneling of your resources just off the bat in terms of mitigation of Russian harm, you know, clearly winning this win over. But secondly then, on the effective deployment in strategic regions, she tells you at the point of which you do want to cripple Russian military or you do want to have some form of impact on Russia, you send them to much more proximate regions that are pro-Russian, that have people who are funding to Russia. She tells you in terms of Belarus, Crimea, your Donetsk region, this is the point of which you have active individuals with Russian support. And the point of which you're able to cripple Russian support then, this is the most proximate regions that are very important within this debate, Judge. But also note that within this Donetsk region as well, you have Ukrainian citizens. At the point of which you send these military troops that you categorize and set up, at the point of which you have extremely specialized set of skills, this is when you're able to rescue your Ukrainian citizens as well. So if you want to take the burden of how you're able to help people, here's where we do it better because we send individuals with specialized skills in order to get the citizens out. Second thing on weighing that, on the perception of your Ukraine attacks. Not just what other countries perceive to you, why is this weighing still one that is valid within this debate? Because we tell you the act of infringing sovereignty in another nation is one that's already looked down upon and one that is already villainized just off that bat, right? That means at the point of which Ukraine needs foreign aid, you cannot spoil or cannot harm any forms of optics that are onto you, any forms of perception onto you. At the point of which you upset views, that's when you have the narrative of Ukrainians being acting on having the power to act on their own. That's the point of which you pull out help from Ukraine because it's not in your best interest, it's not against your interest, and you don't want to be aligned with a country that infringes the sovereignty of another. This is immediate loss of your support then. But secondly, that the US perception that she talks about why it's extremely bad for you. Because note, Judge, that the major funding of Ukrainians come from the US, at the point of which they send the most amount of money to you, they send the most amount of training for your troops. At the point of which US also has an inherent interest in Syria in terms of oil extraction, in terms of having military bases within this region. You also look like senators in US having investment within Syria. This is when both your Democrats and Republican parties have less interest to be in line with you, have less interest to actually send funding to you. All of this is important just because it significantly reduce the amount of support that you're able to get. That means you already have people on the ground in status quo who are upset with the US funding Ukraine because this is not in the best interest of them, or it's not in any likelihood of granting any forms of reward to them. At the point of which you do mess with their interest, this just exacerbates their harm and makes it much more worse in order for you to get that funding in the first place. Thirdly then, on how you are able to strategically edge over the war, she tells you firstly the deployment on the front line because it's the most strategic, you're able to use your skills much more better. But what happens when you're not on the front line is also something to wager because it's extremely important. This kills their case entirely. Firstly, you have more soldiers dying. This becomes worse because they extract all their soldiers into Sudan and Syria. You immediately lose Ukraine towards Russia. Secondly, you have more cities in Ukraine getting bombed by your Russian troops because you don't have your protection force. But thirdly, you have more citizens getting displaced because you have individuals or you have Russian individuals just barging through your city and then killing your enemies. Right? I think this then also creates a detriment towards your Ukrainian economy because you need to pull out funding from other sectors, pull out funding from healthcare, pull out funding from other sectors that are not proximate towards your war in order to fund your military or in order to have some form of repercussion or repercussion towards the military harms that are falling towards you. I think secondly, she tells you how you have other regions that you can help, like Belarus and Crimea, in terms of how you have better ability to help more people. This looks like your pro-Ukrainian people in pro-Russian Asia. But secondly, the likelihood of success of this is much more better because these are cities that you are in control of. These are cities that you are proximate towards. These are cities that you know some form of knowledge, therefore you can rescue the citizens. But fourth, the impact of this military expansion is one that is minuscule at best. Because firstly, Russian mercenaries are being attacked. She tells you how these paramilitary groups are extremely cheap to recruit because their alternative is fighting other wars. Therefore, Russia can always further enforce their bases, strengthen their resource camps. But secondly, the crippling of these resources is one that is likely not going to happen because they always have the inherent ability to protect these resources better. They always have the ability to strengthen and fortify these way more better. All of these four reasons that clearly we win.
Wars are the same. The wars in Sudan and Syria are about specialist paramilitary intervention units that Russia sends to go in and train mercenaries on the ground, for example. They send in to high-tech operations that continue the Assad regime and have widespread harms on the individuals there. I think that if you were able to take a relatively small amount of Ukrainian troops and significantly hinder their ability to succeed, those troops have far more impact than they would ever have on the ground in Ukraine, particularly given the kind of specialist troops that Ukraine is sending. Given that, you should always prioritise that because that's what helps people on the ground. But secondarily, even if it is not the case that they're able to do anything in Syria and in Sudan, the fact that they grind out that conflict, that they make it go for longer, means Russia doesn't take those specialist forces and use them to intervene in other conflicts around the world and make them even better. And as Ethan explains, that should be your top priority in this debate because Russia has terrible incentives and will always do so. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why uniquely there is very little impact to be made on the ground in Ukraine with these troops and therefore why that's unnecessary. Secondly, I'm going to explain what the relative impact is that you can then have in Sudan and Syria instead, and weigh up why that is better than the alternative. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about international buy-in and why we actually get more money from the US rather than turning off international allies. Okay. Firstly then, the first thing I want to note quickly is that we didn't propose a counter model, we proposed the status quo, which is that Ukraine sends in special military forces. And we explain that those are able to do a variety of different things to tie up the Russian units, to use good military strategy in order to reduce them. Given that, what about the impact those units would have on Ukraine? The first thing to note is that I just don't think I particularly care about Ukraine. The material that we get from
from them is that it's important that Ukraine gets more land so that they're able to get peace more quickly. A couple of things here. The first thing to note is that there are cases about relatively marginal changes in Ukraine in the first place, because the amount of troops that we're talking about are relatively low, and any changes they're talking about are about small changes in resourcing that occur. For example, the cost of sending 100 troops on a plane to Africa, even though they say that it's going to be super expensive, is basically nothing compared to the rockets and warheads that they're sending every single day. The relative price of a country in war is really massive, and the relative difference here is really low. I think it's unlikely that's the case, particularly given there are a variety of other factors which I think are likely to be more influential. For example, the outcome of the US election, different other larger factors which were more important in the impact of Ukraine rather than this relatively small change. The second thing is, even if they do create a relative change and Ukraine with these forces would magically be able to get 10 kilometers more ground than they would have anyway, what the current war is a war of attrition and stalemate. Both sides are very unlikely to fall in on any instance, because Russia has demonstrated that it is willing to just grind out this war for as long as possible in order to get what it needs. And so even if it is the case that Ukraine retakes some land, I think it's unlikely that has any real impact on the way that the war occurs. Okay, given that then, why is it actually not that, given that, why do we have an extreme benefit when we do short-term intervention? The first thing to note is that it's not actually that inefficient to do the short-term intervention in the first place. Why is that? The first thing to note is about using resources on the front line. Firstly, I've explained to you that it's likely to have a relative impact given there are millions of troops in Donetsk, and we're talking about, maybe 1,000 troops in these countries, or maybe slightly more. It's relatively small impact. The second thing, though, is firstly, Ukraine has shown they have an excellent military strategy and the capacity to know what to send. So if it is the case that the amount that they can send would bankrupt their country and mean Russia can destroy them, I think it's relatively unlikely that they would do that in the first place. The second thing is that the kind of resources used are probably different. The constraint on weapons in Russia is large-scale combat, things like military warheads that you can use, and large units which are needed to break the forces of the enemy. That's not the same thing that you need in these kind of conflicts, so it's unlikely that happens. Finally, I don't think it's that hard to do it in the first place. Note the cost is obviously higher, firstly in the counterfactual of Belarus, but secondly, the cost is way higher just getting behind Russian lines in the first place. In that instance, I think you're able to be extremely efficient in the use of weapons. Okay, given all of that, what is the context in Sudan and Syria? The first thing to note is that Russia does have boots on the ground. Within the motion themselves, they have mercenaries, and they also have people that they themselves have brought in. For example, they need people to train the mercenaries on the ground. They need a variety of different special forces that they bring in the first place. No, even if I think it is just endless citizens and you think it is just a bunch of citizen mercenaries, there are a couple of really helpful things that we explain happen regardless. Firstly, you still destroy the weapons that Russia is sending to them, and you mean they're less likely to be able to use those weapons in the future and other interventions that might occur. So, for example, they can't send them to other mercenaries that they might hire around the world. Secondly, it still takes resources because they have to spend money on those mercenaries. They say there is a sinking lid on wages because you can always pay people less and less. No, these are civil war conflicts where there are a variety of different factions fighting against each other. And so Russia can't pay super low wages, or if they do so, firstly, that will mean that the forces that they have are really bad and are likely to run away, or they just can't do it in the first place. So you have to still spend a high amount on wages. Thirdly, it still means that they can't win the war. The important comparative that we note here is that in a world in which Ukraine had not intervened, there would be no intervention in Syria. And what that means is that Assad is likely to take control of Syria and entirely hand over control to Russia. What are the impacts of that? They are extremely massive, and they go beyond any individual small-scale impacts and conflict, because it means the entire country is likely to fall. What does that look like? I think it looks like things like the ability for them to have access to massive amounts of resources, which they now can use to sell to other countries. They have massive amounts of access, for example, in Africa, to uranium that they can then use to power different things. All of those things are far more impactful in the first place. But secondarily, it means that when they no longer have their focus on these countries, they're able to switch to other ones. We explained to you, Ethan, that they have a unique incentive to always be looking for more conflict. And so if it is the case that even in the absolute worst case, it's an extra 2 years that they have to fight it out in these countries, I'm perfectly happy to take that trade-off. That means they switch they don't switch to looking at another country in the first place. And it means you're able to destroy their military more before that, and they're not able to do those kind of interventions in the future. Given all of that then, I think it's extremely valuable in the short term to have these kind of impacts, and that's something that we stand for immensely. Finally, then on international effects. Note, firstly, the context here, for example in Syria, is that NATO did intervene in Syria because it's a civil war conflict where Assad is a You know, not someone who's the recognized dictator of Syria, like not the recognized leader. There are a variety of different factions fighting it out. They did intervene, but they pulled out because Russia intervened in the first place for two reasons. Firstly, because Russia was like basically saying that they would pay people money for the American soldiers that they killed. But secondly, because they were afraid that if they did something like hit a Russian jet, it would cause an all-out global war. What does that mean? Two things. I think firstly it signals that the majority of the world is anti-Russia and is like, or is anti these regimes, because if we told you that Ethan, the incentive on Russia is they pick the worst possible regimes that no one likes. So if you're anti-interventionist, you probably think it's okay to go in and stop Russia from intervening to prop up terrible regimes. That's perfectly legitimate. But secondly, I think it means that you're likely to get lots and lots of money from NATO in the first place. Because under the status quo, they're unlikely to do so because they don't think firstly, they don't want to be able to intervene physically, boots on the ground, and secondly, they don't think there's a high likelihood of success. But when there are Ukraine troops on the ground, that's when you get the money from them to be able to go in. And importantly, we know that this means that you don't just get money from NATO, but you also get money from countries which have no incentive to give you money under the status quo. So for example, countries in Africa which don't really care that much about the war in Ukraine, but do care about the Assad regime, and so are willing to give you money in those instances, or do care about their relationship in Sudan. Those are the countries that we care about. The kind of countries that they talk about, for example, ones like Romania, I think the important thing to note is that probably their foreign policy is often based on self-interest, and they have a self-interested desire to not have Russia to continue to succeed. So it's unlikely this is a tipping point that makes them stop supporting Ukraine. Given all of that, it is really easy for Ukraine to frame this as not just interventionism, as interventionism to stop Russia in propping up and being interventionist in and of itself. Given all of that, it's actually able to flip this material. You get better international aid from us. If you get money from countries that you didn't have beforehand, you can take the money and use it to spend in your own Ukraine war anyway. That's a really big benefit that we are able to claim on our side.
Let's start some housekeeping. The first is that this team doesn't get the benefit of defending status quo. The motion dictates they have to increase an expansion of military operations over here. The second thing is that let's just evaluate their strategy. Let's compare what their path to victory is, right? They say you ruin Russian forces in Syria, Russia becomes weaker, but you can just lose the Ukrainian war. They don't give you any analysis as to how the Ukrainian war is going to be sustainable, how you're going to continue pushing back Russia. We give you analysis as to why it's likely going to be worse, the point in which you dedicate resources to Syria and Sudan. They say no, because Russia wants to elongate the war in Syria and Sudan, and Russia is the big bad. I don't understand the strategy. Let's compare it to what we say. We tell you that you push Russia back in Ukraine, you actually win the Ukrainian war, and this is how you limit Russia in the future. I don't understand why that the war and the conflict going on in Sudan and Syria is something that inherently weighs over the conflict going on in Russia and Ukraine. Because this is a value judgment. You cannot value the suffering and death of one group of people over the suffering and death over another group of people. But more importantly, it's a value judgment from the perspective of the Ukrainian special forces. We told you that because of principles that limit the ability of nations to violate the territorial integrities of other people that they're not directly at war with, because of the context of the war and what's going on, and the zero-sum game of resources and what you have, why is it that the Ukrainian special forces are the individuals who have to go to Syria and Sudan and deal with the conflict going on there? Why are they the instrument to dealing with Assad and overthrowing the authoritarian regimes in this country? If US really wants to do this and they don't care about the principle of not being attacking people directly when you're not at war with them, then take your own fucking army and go do it over there instead. This is the reason why Poland, that even though they support Ukraine to the maximum extent, don't send Polish forces into the Ukrainian border and don't directly attack Russia. They'll give you all the money that you need, they'll give you all the resources that you can, but they don't put their own military strength over there because they are not the individuals who are directly at war with Russia. This is a principle that comes out at first that they completely don't respond to. Maybe principles don't eat in these majors as well, but if you don't respond to them, then they stand definitely in this debate. But the last thing over here is that they say Russia is bad, so let's attack Syria and Sudan. But Russia is the big bad. They don't give you any mechanisms to mitigate Russia. They tell you that there's no point sending your special forces over there. So let's say you take them at their absolute best, you get rid of the forces and the regimes in Syria and Sudan. So what? Putin is still in power? I don't understand why this is the tipping point to getting rid of its authoritarian regime. We told you on our side of the house that when you actually win the Ukrainian war, these are much better ways to limit the progress of Russian authoritarianism. I'll give you a couple of responses here. First, they say Russia bad, Putin is a madman. We agree, we're not sitting by idly. Russia and Putin are obviously the bigger threat is a very obvious value judgment of the way things are, which is why we're not sitting by idly, we're actually engaging in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We're giving you mechanism how we're going to win that war over there. The second thing here is that they say Putin will continue to be expansionist no matter what, because he did it in the past, he's going to continue doing it. When he did it in the past, the international blowback was limited. He won the Chechenian war, he won the Georgian war, which is why he had the balls to continue doing more and more things. The point at which international callback and the backlash to his assault on Ukraine was something that was so severe that everyone is speaking out against him and people are actually not on his side anymore. This is the point at which you win this war, you limit the Russian ability to expand into the future. But the third is that they say that other countries don't want to invade Russia because they're scared of Russia and the blowback that they give. Other countries don't want to invade Russia because war is bad. It's unfortunate that war is happening right now. Let's deal with the ongoing immediate conflict that these people have a vested interest in, and then we can care about Syria and Sudan in the future if you really want to. The fourth thing is that why does Ukraine have an obligation to stop Russian expansion into the future and curb Russia 50 years and 100 years from now? We tell you that insofar as we stop the war in Ukraine right now, this is a far better thing to defend. It's a far logical thing to defend as well. The fifth thing here is that if you want to curtail Russia, you do this better by winning the war in the first place. Because when you win the war, this means that Russia is unlikely to attack in the future again. The Russian citizens are going to be aware that we fought a war in the past, we lost, the international community is against us. Maybe we should speak out the next time we have an authoritarian leader that wants to do stupid things like this. The next thing I want to respond to is that they claim that Russia will pull out of the war when you challenge them in Syria. I don't understand why this is true at all. Russia is not Syria. It's unlikely that even if you win everything in Syria, you're going to continue, it's going to limit Russia completely. Russia wants Ukraine. That was the whole point of the Ukrainian war. If you lose Ukraine, you're just feeding into Russian ambitions and Russian interests. They say that if you take the Syria, they will just give up Syria for you because they have lesser interest in this nation, insofar as you only gain resources and things like that from them. But Ukraine is like the breadbasket of Europe. I think it's far more profitable and logical for Russia to go after Ukraine, even if it comes at the expense of losing their interest in Syria and Sudan. The third thing here is that even if you achieve everything you want in Syria, why is the Ukrainian Special Ops the instrument for it? There are plenty of other people who can do it. There's no exclusivity on this argument, so this negative thing. The next thing here is that they claim that Russia is willing to stretch out the war. I don't know why Russia is willing to stretch out the war in Syria and Sudan and continue feeding more money into there, but they're not willing to do it in the Ukrainian border. We tell you it's likely going to be symmetrical on both sides of the house, meaning you have to focus on a thing that is more proximate to European interests as a whole, to the interests of people who are against Russia, to better strategy to actually curtailing Russia in the first place. The last thing then is that Ukraine must intervene if not Assad will continue to rule. I think they themselves tell you why Putin is the biggest bad, let Assad continue to rule. Let's evaluate the clashes in this debate. The first is on which is the better strategy for Ukraine, for this Ukrainian special ops to be employed with, insofar as we can prove that this ends the Ukrainian war, insofar as we prove that it is a better way of curtailing Russian ambitions. We tell you that it's important for Ukraine to regain its territorial integrity, because it gives you a much better footing in peace negotiations because of the principle of a defensive war. Because your intention is not to cripple Russia 100 years into the future, it's not to make sure Putin never rises again, it's to reclaim territory that you already lost, because Ukraine now owes an obligation to individuals on the ground. People have been displaced, people whose cities have been bombed. So it's important for you to regain the territory that you've already lost. This is more proximate to Ukraine. But secondarily, if you want to have a peace negotiations and you want to bring an end to the war and suffering, which they claim is extremely bad, you need to do it in a way that Ukraine has some degree of leverage for a fair peace treaty to be employed. Meaning, you have to be able to regain Ukraine with its full territorial integrity. You cannot do this insofar as the war is still going on in Ukraine, the front lines are still in Ukraine, and Russia holds a large chunk of Ukrainian territory. The second thing here is on the effectiveness of where you should deploy these people. In Sudan and Syria, we tell you that they are isolated, they are far away from the headquarters, your ability to support them and reimburse them and equip them again and again is going to be limited. It's far better if you use them out in the front lines, meaning you can now use these people to target specific Russian generals, specific Russian command posts. This is something that Ukraine has been doing in the war for a very long time. If you don't buy our principle of territorial violation, you're not justified to do it against nations you're not directly at war with, then go do it at Belarus, which is a direct puppet of Putin, where your defense forces are likely to be more effective. I don't understand why Lushenko is less of a threat than Assad or whoever it is that's ruling Sudan. All these countries are authoritarian in nature. They say that the Russians always are going to put the best troops at the front line, so there's no point fighting there. If you're putting the best troops, you're going to fucking lose the war because they really want to take Ukraine from you. So it's important that you put your best troops over there as well, so you can counter these things in multiple different ways. The second layer to this is you're dealing with paramilitary groups, not the Sudanese administration. At best, you just mitigate them. You don't change Assad's motivation to continue supporting Russia. Russia can always hire more. They say Russia cannot hire more because you cannot pay them a lot. If you don't pay them a lot, then they're just going to leave. tell you Russia has plenty of contacts in this region. If not, Assad is just going to supply it. Let's weigh this. You need to care about suffering and war, so you need to care about the war in Ukraine that's going on right now. There's more proximate to the stakeholders and the debate. But the second thing here, it gives greater leverage for peace negotiations. This leads to a greater chance of like a peace treaty being formed within Ukraine and Russia. But the last layer here is in international optics. Ukraine is reliant on foreign aid. They're dependent on holding Russia back, and it's a zero sum. They have a very limited amount of this. The point at which you violate the principle of territorial integrity, intervening in countries you have fucking nothing to do with, is the point at which people are not going to like you. You enforce the narrative that Ukraine can deal with its own. Ukraine is doing all sorts of things that they want. Why should we continue supporting Ukraine? If you don't care about the principle and people can invade anywhere, and US cares about Assad and things like that, let the US fucking invade. I don't know why the special ops have to be the instrument in this interest. But we also give you analysis on the US senators and how they have interest in Syria and Sudan, and violating this and like ruining the stability in this region is likely something to make people go against you in both the Democratic and Republican parties. Their pathway to victory just doesn't make sense. You have to affirm.
Three things on this page. Firstly, on basically what value judgment you should make, how you should consider this debate. Secondly, on which of the two worlds Ukraine's resources are used the most efficiently and effectively. And finally, on how this affects international sentiment across a number of actors. First, on the value judgment. The first thing I want to note, they told us you can't value one set of human lives over another set of human lives. But Ukraine is one country with about 40 million people. Syria and Sudan are two other quite big countries that also have about 30 to 40 million people each. And in all three of those countries, the status quo is that there is a big bloody conflict where the worst case scenario is that it will end with a Russian proxy controlling the whole country and probably being awful and genocidal to all of the people who live there. So firstly, if you believe that buying 100 plane tickets to Khartoum will bankrupt Ukraine overnight, but also will allow them to stop Russia from winning the wars in Sudan and Syria, you should give us this debate because we prevent the immense harm that is like the worst case scenario in all of these wars is the same, but we prevent it in two of the countries, even if we have to concede it in the third. But secondly, obviously that's not the case, and I'm going to explain to you why it doesn't particularly harm Ukraine. The final thing to say is they tell us, oh, why Ukraine? Why does Ukraine have to be the one to do this? But Ethan told you why Ukraine has to be the one to do this. Because Russia are genocidal nutcases with 7,000 nuclear warheads, so even NATO is too scared to take them on directly. That means that Ukraine, which is the only country that Russia is currently directly at war with, is the only country that can do this. Because they are the only country that has nothing to lose anymore, and that is willing to stand up to it. But secondly, because as we explained to you, Russia has a general global agenda forever to do harm, and Ukraine is probably their #1 target because it's directly on their border, and all of the things Ethan told you about their racism towards neighboring people, about their grievance against territories they used to control, against their ethno-nationalist imperialism building, means that for all future time, Ukraine is probably the country that will always suffer the most from Russian ambition, so Ukraine has a special interest in being able to stop Russia from expanding its interests anywhere in the world. And the final thing to say, they tell us there's a general principle of non-intervention, which is why Poland doesn't have boots on the ground. But the EU puts boots in the ground all the fucking time in Africa, right? Constantly they put like peacekeepers into Haiti or but they're constantly intervening, right? The one time they don't intervene is when it's against Russia because they're scared that Russia will invade them because it frequently threatens to invade Poland. That's like non-intervention, no one actually does. Okay, now that we've dealt with that value judgment, let's talk about most of the meat of this debate, which is how effective will this intervention be and how likely is it to be. The first thing I want to note is right at the start we told you, Ukraine is fighting a war against a superpower and they've carried it on for 3 years and done quite well. I think that means you should believe that Ukrainian high military command are quite smart, are likely quite good at making decisions. I want to note here, obviously I can't just posit Ukraine's smart so we should win this debate, but both sides are making a variety of relatively unsubstantiable claims. Like, I can't prove to you how much it costs to send people to Sudan or how to win the war. Ultimately, you'll have to make some kind of value weighing. Given that they didn't explain to you why it is likely that Ukraine would be particularly irrational, why it would likely act against its self-interests, why it would likely take actions that are very harmful to it, I think that when you're considering the claim, maybe it's really expensive to Ukraine, maybe it's not really expensive to Ukraine, you should consider that our claims are more likely because Ukraine is likely to act in self-interested ways. Let's talk through what those claims are. The first thing to say is let's talk about the effectiveness of intervening, let's talk about the cost of sending people outside of Ukraine. The first thing to know is they tell us, oh, it's a zero-sum game, so any troops you take out of Ukraine, like, it is costing you in the war against Russia. But obviously Russia also has troops in those other countries. So if it becomes harder for Russia to fight in Syria, and they told us, oh, that means Russia will drag the conflict in Syria on, that means that Russia also has to divert troops and resources away from the front line in Ukraine. So on the zero-sum game argument, it balances out. But then they tell us, oh, the harms here are that you lose your ability to protect your citizens through like search and rescue or stopping airstrikes or whatever. Which is like, it's qualitatively different resources you use if you're sending 5 dudes on like a fake passports to go airstrike a Russian training camp in Khartoum, compared to whether you just use a Western provided anti-aircraft gun to protect the skies of Kyiv. They're just different resources. And in terms of money, I think the relative marginal cost of sending a small special ops team to another country compared to sending like literally tens of thousands of soldiers fresh to the front line every day, which is what they have to do just to keep it about the same on the front line. It's just such a marginal cost, but I think it makes an essentially negligible, like no impact on Ukraine's ability directly on the front lines. Then they tell us, oh, you should use the special ops to assassinate Russian generals. Firstly, as they told us, they already do. So they're already doing this, but they're also sending them to go do useful, cool things elsewhere. But the second thing is, it's actually much more expensive and difficult to infiltrate Russian lines, sneak under their radar, breach through the high concentrations of Russian troops to go and find the Russian general that's on Donetsk, because they're surrounded by the biggest concentration of Russian force in the world. It's comparatively much easier, cheaper, and quicker to find the Russian general and intelligence operatives in their base in Deres or in the Syrian desert, because they're just out in the middle of nowhere. You just call in a drone strike and blow up the base, and you get it much easily and more quickly. So I think we get much bigger impact. Then but even if they did make a marginal impact on your ability to win on the front lines in Ukraine, we told you at first that Putin will just drag the war on forever and a day until he wins or dies. So you won't come to the negotiating table. Your leverage is irrelevant because it won't happen. They said, oh, you might take land and kill Russian troops. They already did that 2 years ago. They did this massive campaign. Russia suffered its biggest military loss since World War II, and Putin didn't blink. He just kept going. That's why we're having this debate. There's no way that they bring an end to the war, so the leverage stuff is completely irrelevant. Now let's talk about the impact that it has on Russia. Basically, the point here is that if Russia is able to win the war in Syria and win the war in Sudan, it now has total access to 2 whole countries worth of resources and money and all of that shit, but also it just takes the troops it previously had in those countries and uses them to fulfill its ends elsewhere. Obviously, if we even make a marginal difference in these tightly contested wars, where Russia currently makes an outsized impact because it's the only one using high-tech weaponry in the war, if we just even the playing field, because now there's some high-tech weaponry on both sides, they don't get that massive benefit that they're really close to achieving in those countries, and that massively curtails their ability to impact the war. Finally, let's talk about international sentiment. There are kind of 3 claims. The first is that generally people don't like interventionism. Firstly, they just do, right? I've already told you, France intervenes in Africa all the time, it's just that they're scared of Russia. But secondly, Romanian citizens don't give a fuck about the war in Sudan. It's not going to change their foreign policy when Russian tanks are bearing down on them. But the second thing is they tell us local countries will be upset that you're not supporting the Syrian regime. But Assad was kicked out of the Arab League, right? Lots of neighboring countries really hate Assad, and Saudi Arabia has a revealed preference for military interventions in neighboring Arab countries. I think that the countries who are anti-Assad now find Ukraine as an ally because they really like them, and the ones who are pro-Assad were probably Russian allies anyway. Finally, on the US and NATO and stuff, Lucy already told you, NATO doesn't want Russia to succeed either. If you are making steps that stop Russia from winning in any war that is beneficial to the US, that is beneficial to NATO, that means they're more likely to support you. They would do it themselves, but they're too scared of Russia.
framing on how we win the debate, secondly on the relative likelihood of different impacts, and finally on the non-interventionist principle in international relations. Firstly on how this debate should be won. I think we explained that Ukraine is the only force which can intervene against Russia in these conflicts because other countries are afraid of a global war and they're unlikely to be able to intervene otherwise. Given that, the specific troops that we're talking about can either be in Ukraine or in Sudan and Syria. I don't think you should judge this debate based on the Belarus countermodel, given that they spend about 2 sentences in it throughout their entire speeches. Given that, with those 2 examples, I think that the thing you should judge this debate on is firstly, obviously the quality of change. And I think that we're able to explain that even in the case that you do create good outcomes for Ukraine, that's something that is relative to the more people that exist in Sudan and Syria, and those people are the ones who should be prioritized as well. But secondly, the relative likelihood of that change and the ability for these troops to actually make a substantive difference. Because that is what leads to a value judgment, right? The reason we make value judgments is so that we can say, oh, that you should do this action because of this effect. Given that then, on the relative likelihood, I think there are 3 things that we discuss about why it is better for them in these instances. Firstly, the ability to affect the outcome of the relevant conflict in a face-to-face sense. I think we explained that these troops have specific value in these conflicts that they would not have in the front lines in Ukraine because they are particularly involved in special intervention for these kind of circumstances rather than the front-on-front kind of conflicts they have in Ukraine. We get a variety of different examples of them, how they could be better used for things like search and rescue, etc. Obviously, there might be some situations in which they could be better used, but I think we firstly are able to win on just explaining that they are better able to have an impact generally face-to-face in doing things like saving civilians, like taking out military trainers so you no longer have those conflicts exist to the same extent, which has a massive impact on the civilians of those countries, the innocent people who did not sign up to have Assad be so awful to them. That is an extreme impact that we can win the debate on in and of itself. Even if you don't buy that and you think the troops could have a relatively same impact just in the fighting that they have, what is the ability to affect the outcome of the wider conflict? I think we explained firstly that you're able to make sure that Russia has to dedicate more and more money to this conflict, and often you draw out the conflict significantly, you're able to stop them from being able to do the worst things that they would have been able to do otherwise. Particularly given their own material, which is that the people that Ukraine are facing is often people who are just badly paid like mercenaries that hardly know how to hold their weapons right. It's probably really easy for you to make a substantial change in that conflict. Compare that to the example of the Ukraine war. A couple of different notes here. The first one is that it is an extremely big war, so it's unlikely that the small amount of troops we're talking about here has an impact compared to the relative impact that we're talking about here. The second thing to note is that even if it is the case that they explain there's some massive resource loss that you get, they don't explain how that actually leads to a substantial change. Because I think in the worst case it leads to them maybe gaining 10 kilometers worth of ground, but the then explanation is, okay, they gain that ground and then that makes them more likely to be able to come to the peace table, and then Russia is more happy at them, and then that happens. I think it's a really long chain of logic, and we explained to you that Russia is unlikely to make those kind of concessions in the first place because they are willing to just do whatever they want. So even if they do think you gain more ability to win, like to gain territory, they don't explain how that leads to a stopping in peace. Finally, the effect on Russian interests. We explained to you that the ability for them to have less access to control and wealth is immensely impactful on both wars. So even insofar as you care about the Ukraine war, you should probably care about them not having access to things like uranium anymore. But secondly, we explained to you that they're not able to use those forces elsewhere to intervene in other countries. So beyond just the 60 million people we're talking about in Sudan and Syria, all of the other people in conflicts throughout the world that Russia could intervene with, we say those people too, the numbers are on our side. Finally, on the non-interventionist principle, I think this was asserted on the right to not intervene on sovereign territory, but we explained to you that it's not sovereign territory because the regimes that are going to be propped up by Russia are awful ones which don't have the legitimacy of an actual regime, so it's perfectly legitimate to intervene. But even if they do, I think we explained that countries act on self-interest and that NATO and other countries have an incentive to fund you money they wouldn't have otherwise. And in particular, we explained that you uniquely get African countries on your side which previously didn't have an incentive to provide you money in the first place.
5 call-outs and then moving on to the 3 issues of the debate. Number 1, note that this team lacks missing logical links. First, they say that zero-sum hurts Russia too, therefore now it is effective to expand its military operations. Let's actually compare the degree of this kind of zero-sum or shift of resources, right? Russia is just sending few mercenaries to Sudan and Syria to train local citizens of a paramilitary. Compared to Ukraine, you are trading off the best of the best, your special forces, to send outside of an active war zone just to go to Sudan and Syria. This means that you're trading off a fuck ton of more resources for Ukraine then. This means that also number 2, they say that when you expand military operations in Sudan and Syria, for some reason, you can just make Russia stop the war. Let's actually weigh this and who, in a balance of probabilities, get to actually make Russia stop whatever the fuck they're doing. On our side, we have told you the framing that the war is not at a stalemate, and that now we employ the most strategic way of directly attack Russian forces using the best of your forces to do so. On their side, they're stopping via a proxy war by just mitigating the resources of Russia. It is still unclear to what extent this actually harms Russia. We say that on a balance of who has better clarity on a pathway to victory of achieving peace negotiations, which lowers Russian legitimacy in this war, we clearly take this debate. Secondary, I'm going to call out for the squirreling. They say that they want to send special forces to Sudan and Syria for some reason that they can take down Assad. First of all, it's not Ukraine's fucking intention to take down Assad, and it's a weird burden to take anyway. But even if you do take down Assad, like, so what? The Russian-Ukraine war is still happening. The war is still symmetric on both sides. Like, you don't get to claim this weird burden in the motion when the motion doesn't even ask for it. Thirdly is that they strawman our case. They claim that our counter model is about going to Belarus, when down the bench we have told you the counterfactual is about just shifting your special forces back to the front lines. This means the Belarus was just, and even if you don't want to change the special forces to other countries, Belarus is a more strategic way. This is just to show that their option of going to Sudan and Syria is just far more ineffective. This means they have little to no engagement towards the change of special forces. This means that also number 2, it's stronger to say that we will bankrupt Ukraine for some reason, but we've never told you that. We're just saying that the shift in resources means that you trade off the best in your front lines, but more often than not, on a value judgment basis, you trade off the lives and sufferings of the citizens in Ukraine. You trade off time to having to send aid to Sudan and Syria just to have to help your special forces over there. Number 4 is that they constantly lie in this debate, especially when they assert that for some reason the EU will intervene with this. Like, what the fuck? That's just an assertion. There's no structural analysis to prove why this is true. Lastly, they also concede that war is bad. Okay, if you say that war is bad, you've never really justified then why is it that an expansion in Sudan and Syria is something that's good? Because absent of Ukraine, there won't be any war there. There won't be any suffering there. Therefore then, 3 issues. Number 1, is it better to take down Russia or to stop the war? We think that the burden is high from them to prove that to have to take down Russia. So on our side, their best case is that they get lower resources, but it's still unclear why this is a tipping point to make Russia stop being evil. On our side, even at our worst case, we don't stop the fucking war, but at least we provide a better footing for peace negotiations. The impact of this, you directly hurt Russia's interest of Ukraine territory, which is the main objective. Number 2, you're allowed to foster international optics for Ukraine. That means you increase sentiments of anti-interventionists. That means there's more pushback to anti-war in the future. Russia will think twice before starting war again. Secondarily, they put a burden on Ukraine. Why? Okay, even if principally Ukraine should be the one to do it, but okay, even if your principles is good, but if your practicality and you don't prove the effectiveness of it, in the process of it, you have prolonged war, you have more deaths, your economy is going to be something bad. You increase the chances of Russia to then be good in the fucking Ukraine borders of the Ukraine war. Lastly, what does Russia actually care about? To actually win this debate, we need to understand the main interest of Russia is Ukraine. Therefore, we need to directly attack Ukraine.
Thank you very much for the debate. We all thought it was like a pretty close and a pretty high quality debate. I think there's a lot of good back and forth from teams, a lot of good deployment of specialist knowledge as well. I think a good coverage of the conflict. There'll be a few points of general feedback though, reasons for the result. First point of general feedback here, I think teams from a strategic standpoint could be a lot more specific about what goals they're choosing for their case or for the debate to happen, what they think can actually happen, and trying to focus in on that even if it's not big, if it's not a big goal like winning the war, stopping the war, etc. And I think being a more, I guess, what's the word, more disciplined in like the way we describe impacts, etc., to tie it to those goals, why those goals are important, I think will help teams focus their case a bit more and give more opportunity to expand why, I guess, likelihood of achieving that goal and the benefits of achieving that goal specifically. I think the second thing is teams could do a bit better job. These next couple of feedback pieces, I think, are variable at different points in the debate. At some points they're okay, at some points they need work. The first one of those is teams need to do a better job at not strawmanning the other team's case and actually responding to the best version of it and giving the full credit to the nuances of what they're actually achieving, which does link a little bit more to identifying what is the goal the team is happening. I think at times teams were just responding to, I think, very inflated versions of each other's cases and not what was actually happening. I think secondly, This debate obviously operates in two very different theatres of the war. I think at times teams were very specific operating in what their preferred theatre was and not enough time in each other's theatre and sort of like taking down the other one and why that wouldn't operate. So making sure we're spending a bit of time in both of these elements of the debate and trading off those two a bit more clearly. Again, something that happened in some parts okay in the debate, some parts needed work. And I think the last thing, no, I've already said that. So, all right, those are the main things of the debate. In terms of the result then, it was unanimous among the voting members of the panel, but split across the whole panel, and the result was given to side negative. Congratulations. So yeah, the trainee gave it to Af. I think all of us agreed that it was a close debate. What I'll try and do in this adjudication is point to areas where there was differentiation on the panel, but I would advise teams to speak to all members to try and get the different views on how the debate went. So, in terms of the clashes then, for me I think there are broadly two clashes. I think this probably reflects largely how I saw the debate, of just weighing up the effectiveness of Ukraine operating in the expansion territories, or expansion conflicts, weighing up against the effectiveness of these special forces operating on the home front overall, and then the third issue is just looking at how international perception works. For me, the first two are the more important ones in the debate, because I think they tend, one where teams spent the most times, but two I think on the international perception. While I think there are potentially big harms there of like USA cutting off funding, etc. to Ukraine's conflict, I don't think those impacts are ever made out to be particularly big or spent a lot of time on. So for me, the meat of the debate was decided in whether or not, in where these forces would be most effectively utilised. So let's look at what the effect would be in the expansion conflicts of having these special forces. So I think basically this is also just a proxy so both these questions are just proxies to the trade-off of where the resources are actually most useful. So I think that the first claim we get from negative about the expansion areas is that this is it's a pushback against Russian expansion in other parts of the world that allows them to push against control and allows them to sort of push Russia back in areas that are also important to it, so sort of frustrate it a little bit in its way it's acting, but also prevent it from accessing resources, etc. I think the resources that exist in the area around things like oil or uranium or in more soft senses, allies and power and proxy countries around them as well. I will note this first part here about the impacts that these conflicts have is a point of differentiation on the panel around exclusivity of what is given from those countries. Like, is this the only place Russia can get resources from? Is this the only place they can get alliances and power from? I think that does probably to some extent lessen the claim a little bit, but that's not a response that's given as from AF in the debate explicitly or pointing to where else they can get these things from. So it's not like a reason to not credit these things from negative, because at the end of the debate we think negative proves there is an impact here. What does AF give us on this though? The first thing they give us is that from first affirmative is that there's actually just not that much Russian military there. It's local militias, it's local citizens of these countries that are actually doing the fighting, and that they're super easy to replace. You just pay for new paramilitary troops to come in, and there's not significant harm or involvement from Russia there. I think that what Neg's able to do is point out that even if they are, well, I think one, they make a factual challenge, saying that there are Russian boots and troops down there, even if it's a small group. But two, there is still significant costs. So things like hiring and training these people, having paramilitary leaders there, generals, etc., to run the operations, or if not generals, like other members of the Russian military there, to run the operation. That puts a lot of pressure on them. But also, the more that you kill or disrupt the local militia groups, the higher you have to pay them to make sure they keep engaging in the conflict, rather than just taking a small amount of money and running away. So what I think that does mean is maybe we're not targeting lots of Russian units there, but we are frustrating Russian operations there and Russian people there. The second claim we get from AF, second affirmative, is that, well, we don't need to put boots on the ground as Ukraine. There's foreign aid, there's other bodies, etc. that can do it. I think this particular clash drifts at times into like a principal question of who has rights and obligations to intervene and whether or not Ukraine has a greater obligation here or somewhere else. Personally, I think the practical consequences of this do weigh more, because things will, I think, mention obligations and talk about it, don't ever actually do a weigh up or a concentration as to why those things ought to outweigh any principal or practical obligations. I do think if we are to engage somewhat principally, I think Neg points out that this is able to make a link between this and the impacts on Ukrainian citizens. So if we believe our principal framing should do things that are good for Ukraine, and this helps them frustrate Russia, and that helps Ukraine, then it kind of does fulfill that principal burden. But on the second thing of just whether or not they are obligated to intervene, I think AF is also, so Neg is able to point out that there are instances where intervention happens all the time with the EU in Africa, or more pertinently, the NATO and stuff did go in until like Russia became involved, and that's what pushed them away. So there was willingness to go in, it's just they didn't want to start a nuclear war, which means that Ukraine is really the only actor that can go in because it's kind of already in that war, so it's not likely to provoke a bigger conflict then. So in any case then, I think what we've got there is that like these boots are probably providing something more useful than foreign aid can when they describe things like being able to attack training camps, being able to attack leaders, being able to stop control of government, etc. In that environment. That I think is also important of a question of that thing, general feedback about setting goals. I think what AF unfortunately does a bit in response is focus too much on this idea that NEG won't be able to like overthrow Assad or disrupt the Russian invasion entirely. That wasn't necessarily NEG's claim in the debate. I think the claim they make, they can just prolong that conflict, stretch it out, drag Russian resources down, which puts a strain and a pressure on Russia, is a goal that they set and that they achieve, but AF tries to put most of their responses on a higher level of what AF is, what NEG is not actually trying to achieve in the debate. So I think at this point then, what they've done is show that there is a degree of effectiveness that these troops can have in these expansion areas in pushing back against Russia, restricting some of their access, and just dragging into these conflicts that go on for longer and longer, and that does impact the capacity to access resources and drag resources down from the Ukraine. Obviously that is like not a huge, and I think, sorry, the very last thing NEG does on this is then say, if we had nobody there, Russia could likely take over. That leads to, I guess, all those things I guess were frustrating, they get more access to, and then the harms of that being more powerful. Given that then, let's weigh that up then against what this group of special forces could otherwise be doing in the Ukraine front, and whether or not that would be significantly better as an outcome here. So what does AF tell us on this part of the debate? They tell us that, I guess they give us two options. The first one is they can just be on the front lines, pushing back, helping with like trying to gain territory, etc. So the more territory we gain, if it was only 10 kilometers, is the number given in the debate, that is still more that we can push on them for ceasefire, more that we can push on them for the negotiations and the talks, and more that we can protect our citizens. Or they can take a more of a different approach of like going into Donbass or Belarus and operating more special forcey, like I guess, attacking generals, etc. There, and that's how they can be deployed. I think it's not unreasonable that AF responds later in the debate to say, well, that we weren't explicitly counter-modelling doing Belarus or Donbass, etc. But it is something that AF raises, something they could otherwise do with these troops. Again, that's where I think the example of specificity about what you want to be doing here can be useful to help sort of target impacts, etc. But I think NEG is able to engage with both those concepts and why either one of them is the most effective use of these troops. I think the first good observation that NEG makes, or I think the NEG makes, is clarifying that this is likely to be quite a small group of very specialised special forces trainers. So it's not like there's a huge amount of resources going. And I think the logic they give there about why Ukraine obviously has a stronger priority of not losing its country, so it's not likely to dedicate a huge amount of resources that are likely to compromise that overall goal. So I don't think it's likely to be a huge group of people, or numbers aside, not a group of people that would significantly compromise their chances of success in the home front, because obviously that is the more proximate ground for them to win on. That then means that I think their capacity to impact a conflict that both teams agree is a bit of a stalemate, and both teams agree that Russia and Ukraine are not massively winning or losing or overpowering the other one on, is actually likely to be quite minimal. So I think we need more detail here from AF about what they're doing on the front line. So are they just leading up the troops, etc. Like are they running over the trenches or whatever they're doing to try and make it clear about what exactly it is that they are doing in that environment. I think what NEG also does well here is to specify it's not just about the troop numbers, but the skills they present as special forces troops aren't necessarily what is needed on those front lines. So the front line question we're talking about here are things like we need missiles, we need other artillery and resources to take a bigger war step here. Those are not things we're sending to Syria and Sudan. We're just sending people here to do like spy work, assassination work, order drone strikes and target them, etc. So I think then in terms of the particular resources that are being used, it is also not a direct trade-off between these two conflicts, which again means I don't think that the Ukraine conflict is particularly hard. I would like to hear more on their third response, which is just the idea that there are much bigger things that will impact the Ukraine war, like what happens in the USA election, etc. Actually, maybe that's just I would like to hear more because I'm interested in the concept of it. I don't know if it'll help much for the debate, but I think it does add a little, maybe a margin as to why this won't be the bigger thing that happens overall. So what I think all this means then is that on like the pushing back of the front, the being engaged in there, unlikely to have a massive impact because not the same set of forces or resources are being used. On the second set of things of like the more special force type operations, Donbass, Belarus, etc. I think we need some good responses later in the debate from NEG as to why doing this, basically what is the same operation they'd be doing in either theatre of war, is significantly more difficult in the Ukraine theatre of war because of how more well guarded those areas are, how much more troops there are around, how much more difficult it is to cross enemy lines, etc. Whereas if you are in the Sudan and Syria theatre, Like there's still difficulty, but you're not in the same context being surrounded by the highest concentration of Russian troops, etc. You're more likely to be able to operate in that way. I think the last question then, so yeah, I think all that means then that I think that on both those things, we don't see this particular unit or units offering a huge degree of push or leverage to get the outcomes that AF wants on fixing the Ukraine war. So when AF puts a lot back on NEG about, you haven't fixed the Ukraine war, you're abandoning, etc., I don't think NEG is necessarily abandoning the Ukraine, but just these resources aren't helping that much in achieving that goal that both teams want. I think that was also where the panel split a little bit about just how much of a loss this would be to the Ukraine front of the war, with the majority of the panel thinking it would not actually be a significant amount of loss. The last thing I want to note on this issue is this question of expand and how much extra NEG is putting in there. I've reread the motion a bunch of times, and I think it might be, sorry to the ADCOR, a motion wording question here of that we oppose Ukraine expanding. Is Ukraine expanding what the info slide says they're doing, or is the motion saying expanding on top of what the info slide is doing? I think is genuinely an unclear question. Even if we were to agree with the motion, you have to take the info slide and then expand off that, I still think they give some reasons as to why it's not going to be such an expansion that it's going to be so crippling to to Ukraine's forces in the Ukraine conflict. So I think at that point then, they're still not compromising a huge amount, and the motion doesn't require them to compromise a huge amount then, so long as they're still expanding it somewhat, which I think they reasonably do in the debate by making it a bit bigger. In any case, I think that is a question of the motion. I didn't want to ask the ADCOR about that. Anyway, I digress. Last question then is on the international perceptions, what's going to happen here. I thought this argument was quite promising from Affirmative, and I think could have gone a bit more in the debate with the idea that if the Ukraine is occupying lots of its money and its resources in conflicts that aren't directly related to the Ukraine, that loses international support for aid for Ukraine from the USA, from its senators having interest in Syria, etc., which reduces its overall funding and therefore hurts in both conflicts, because then they're wasting resources and they can't actually help in the home fight. I think the problem here is that the biggest mechanism that's focused on from AF as to why that would be lost is that people don't like interventionist states, they don't like countries getting involved in conflicts that otherwise wouldn't. However, I think that what NEG is able to prove is that lots of countries would like to actually be involved in these conflicts, but just can't. So NATO and the USA, etc., do want to stop Russia. They do see it as the big bad in the world, but can't because of the political ramifications and the risk of conflict escalation. At that point, then I think that the risk of losing lots of funding is actually probably quite minimal in the debate. I think they also posit that there might be increases in funding. So perhaps there are other countries or states in Africa that would like to fund a bit more. They don't care about what happens in Ukraine, but they do care about what happens in Sudan. So they're more likely to fund. And given if Ukraine is the only actor in there, you might get additional streams of funding to support those groups going forward in that sense. Again, I think this is where the panel also differed about how much extraditional funding it would be and how much of a cost it would be to Ukraine by having this action taking place, and that I think that the minority of the panel believed that more countries would be angry about this violation of sovereignty, etc. However, the majority thought that, given especially the context of Russia, its risks to global security, that countries, and how willing countries have otherwise been to be engaged in these conflicts, or engaged in intervention, they wouldn't be that worried about it and would still be happy to continue funding, if not give more funding. So in international perception, I don't think Ukraine goes down significantly in the debate. So to weigh all that up, I think at the end of the debate, no massive impact on international perception. There's not a huge or any particular loss to the operational effectiveness of the Ukraine theatre of war by moving the troops here, but we can shift the needle in some other ways that have impacts in these theatres of war. That's why negative takes the debate. Hope that all made sense. Thank you again very much for the debate.